The developer and the bank will sell the condo at 800,000. There'll be a $400,000 loss, probably plus legal fees, and they'll come after you. And of course, then your only option is to either pay that off for the rest of your life or go bankrupt. When it turned out that they were caught with these fraudulent mortgages, their whole business cratered. That was the opportunity for the government to step in, the regulator to step in and investigate mortgage brokers and say, well, where is all these approvals coming for these new mortgages? Like, because the banks also use independent mortgage brokers, right? And that would have been the moment. And there was no action taken.
The Canadian housing bubble is imploding, and I have got the honor of having my favorite guest on here, which is Hilliard Macbeth, to talk about what is happening and all the financial engineering that has gone on since we last spoke. How are you doing, Hilliard, this morning?
I'm doing great. It's an extended summer here in Edmonton, Alberta. It's going on unbelievably nice and warm. And
yes, and I've heard no smoke really this year, so that's another blessing, really. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what is really going on with the bubble cycle right now, firstly, to kind of kick this off. So with everything that's kind of gone on and where we are right now, where do you think we are on this cycle? Do you think we're like in this bull trap phase or more tilting towards that fear and capitulation?
Yeah, so I think in the housing market, I think we're because there isn't enough activity to really signal that we might be sucking buyers back in after a drop. It's like they're staying away. So it's more like the fear is starting to creep in there. And I think the signs are all there. I mean, you've got huge record numbers of listings and sales. Although I saw the Canadian Real Estate Association this morning, we were talking on Monday morning here, said that sales ticked up, the headline, and it was on the CBC News this morning too, if you can believe it. And then I went back and looked at it and said, well, it was up 1% over from a absolutely rock bottom, never seen in 10 years or 20 years level. It bounced up 1%. So that was the highlight of the report. Then they give the prices, and the prices, well, of course, expensive homes are excluded, and it's a typical average price and all that blah blah blah. But in reality, prices have come down quite a bit. But you don't know where the real price is because you don't have enough activity. This is the problem with real estate. Unlike the stock market, you don't find out for a long time where the real market is. So the numbers in Toronto, for example, for single family home, they've come down quite a bit depending on what suburb you're talking about. But 20%, somewhere 10 to 20 to 30%. But the CREA is excluding expensive homes. Well, almost all the homes in the single family bracket in Toronto are expensive. And in the condo market in Toronto, there's very few sales. There's pre-construction buyers who are struggling to close on the new condos that are coming out. There's people still buying new condos because they agreed to buy them 3 or 4 years ago in some cases. But I suspect on the resale of condos, like say a 5 or 10-year-old condo, there's very little activity. So who knows what the real price is, and we'll never know because it's quite disappointing actually. The real index that the CRE puts out is not very real at all. It's been changed several. I'm now 10 years into this. My first book came out 10 years ago, 2015, on this topic. And the way that they calculate the prices of housing under the CREA, the Canadian Real Estate Association, and the biggest element of that is the Toronto Real Estate Board, they've changed it several times. And so they've got several indices, but in reality, prices have probably come down quite a bit more than what the headline numbers show. And the other thing, of course, is that people are.
Today's video is brought to you by Kinsta, the hosting provider I use for my website. Slow websites, random downtime, and useless support. It's like running your business with one hand tied behind your back. That's why I switched to Kinsta, managed hosting for WordPress. I can let experts handle the tech so I don't have to. My site can run up to 200% faster with edge caching, 37 data centers, and over 300 CDN locations. Security, that's locked down with DDoS protection and an up to 99.99% uptime guarantee. And if something breaks, real WordPress pros, not bots, answer within minutes. What about their dashboard? It's way easier and you can get back to managing your site with ease again. Don't just take my word for it. NASA, TripAdvisor, Indeed, all use and trust Kinsta. They've got an impressive Trustpilot rating. Stop babysitting your website, Kinsta will migrate it for free. Plus, your first month is free and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Hit the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started. Thanks to Kinsta for sponsoring today's video.
The other thing, of course, is that people are really emotionally attached to that price that they think their property is worth. It probably goes back a couple of years. The market peaked in 2022, so now it's 3 years old. But they remember that peak price, that house on their street that isn't as nice as their house. Their house is nicer for several reasons. If you ask them, they'll tell you they think they deserve at least that price. And if they aren't forced in some way to sell, they're probably going to just sit at their price and wait, quite a while longer.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is kind of crazy, which is happening right now, is I saw a video that went viral. CTV News put it out, I think, on Thursday or Friday.
And it was recently sold on assignment for $590,000. They're now on the hook to cover the difference.
And now I have a mortgage on this property for $300,000 and I don't own it.
And it was about a man who had a mortgage on a pre-construction condo, but he didn't even own it anymore. They didn't really give much of the fine details on what was going on there, but what I found interesting was that guy, he got possession of his, well, he didn't get possession of it because he sold it, but it was due to complete this year, and he bought in 2020.
In 2020, Bazios and his wife put down a deposit for a 600 square foot condo in Toronto, valued at $884,000. But as interest rates rose and the condo market fell, keeping the investment property became impossible. The Bazios couldn't close on their condo.
So we haven't even reached the point where the big part of the bubble, 2021 and 2022, all those pre-construction units are coming online. And this chart that I want to put on the screen now kind of just, I mean, it shows how many completions are happening right now in Toronto, which is just insane.
Yeah, and like on that chart, it goes to the first quarter of 2025. If you go into 2026 and 2027, there's still I don't know if there's that many. There's more coming. So what they do on those. I'm sure some of your listeners know this, but maybe some don't. What they do with pre-construction condos when the market was hot in 2021, 2022, they would set the price based on an escalation of at least the rate of inflation. You were buying the pre-construction condo at, say, if regular condos were selling for $1 million, they would price it at $1.2 million, because by the time completion came, it would be at least 20% higher than it was in 2022. And of course, exactly the opposite has happened. So that there's no way that these people can get, so they put their deposit down in 2022, 2025 comes at 1.2 million, but the going rate for new condos now is probably below 1 million. So the most financing they can get is probably 800,000 if they can even get that. And now they got a gap of $400,000. And really all they were doing, in a lot of cases, they didn't even plan to ever take possession of that condo. They were just going to flip the $50,000 down payment. They were going to flip it for $100,000 and make $50,000. They're going to double their money. Right. So it's there's so many aspects to that. It's crazy, right? What were the developers thinking? What were the lenders thinking? Now, I don't think there was a bank involved in the deposit. That would have just been maybe a line of credit. The bank wouldn't even know why the $50,000 was going out of the account. The banks are involved on the possession financing when the day comes when the people actually have to put up the other $950,000. And of course they weren't looking ahead 3 years at that point. But it's going to be lawsuits, people. So as people probably already know, but if you fail to, in this example, say the current market is 800,000, but your apartment was agreed. The agreement was at 1.2 million. You're on the hook for that $400,000, even though you only put $50,000 down. It's amazing. Like, you're on the hook for that. And if you don't come up with it, or can't come up with it, I guess in most cases it'll be cannot come up with it because you can't get the financing. You say, well, okay, you keep my deposit, I'm walking away. Well, you can't walk away. They'll pursue you. The developer and the bank will sell the condo at $800,000. There'll be a $400,000 loss, probably plus legal fees, and they'll come after you. And of course, then your only option is to either pay that off for the rest of your life or go bankrupt. And unfortunately, probably in many cases, the bankruptcy option will be the one that's chosen. So It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare for people, and you can point the finger at a number of different actors in that whole scenario. But the reality is today, it doesn't matter who's to blame for getting into that situation. It's going to be a real headwind for the economy in Canada when all these people are struggling to get out from under that.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. And one thing I also wanted to ask you, because I think it's kind of insane and it's all come out since we last spoke, is the financial engineering of blanket appraisals. Seemed very similar to like mispricing assets, the assets being the loans that the banks are obviously giving to these people with the blanket appraisals. Seems very similar to like in 2008 when people were getting 100%, even above 100% LTV loans, because that's essentially what you're doing. And I wonder what you thought of that when you first heard about the blanket appraisals.
There's different stories. I'm not an insider in that, and even insiders, you don't always get the same answer. You ask the same question, you get three different answers. But but the banks do follow rules. That the one thing that they went to a computerized thing. So the bank officer would put in a postal code, and he'd look at the request for a mortgage, and he'd see the average price in that postal code. And if it sort of lined up, okay, then he said, okay, I can approve that. This is my understanding. I haven't checked with anybody that's actually involved in that, but this is what I understand happened. And in a hot market, that's kind of like, well, if I make a mistake as a bank loan officer, the market's going to be 10% higher next year. My mistake will never be uncovered, because the people will just, if they get into trouble, they lose their job or whatever, they'll just sell the property for 10% more than they paid for it, and everybody's happy, right? So that went on for a long time. Now I think with the prices dropping, it's going to change. So that whole blanket appraisal thing is probably going to be thrown out the window, and they're going to go back to the system where somebody actually goes to the property and he looks at it and make sure that it actually exists, as that's the problem, and then checks the situation and then approves the loan. And unfortunately, the banking systems are just like any other human aspect of this cycle, so the peak and the trough, in that they get very, very easy going at the peak because prices are rising and they really can't make a mistake. And at the trough, they get very, very cautious. And I have a story about that. I was in Whitefish, Montana, and it was like 3 or 4 years ago, and I met this wealthy investor, and he was trying to buy some of these really expensive properties in Whitefish. They're almost all owned by non-residents. Came on the market after the global financial crisis at huge discounts. Like he told me the numbers, I forget exactly. Let's say a $5 million was for sale for $2.5 million, like half, right? So, and he had lots of money. He said, what do you want on a mortgage? He needed a $500,000 mortgage on a $2.5 million property, and the bank wouldn't approve it. And I thought, how is that possible? Like he's got over $1 million of equity. How could they not approve it? And I said, but then I thought, well, that sort of makes sense. I guess they were really shell shocked from 2009, 2010. That was a brutal, housing bubble bursting in the U.S. and the people working at the bank. He said, no. He said, that was just last year, 10 years after the global financial. He says he went to every lender in the area. He finally got a private loan from the vendor, and he paid it off within, he didn't have any trouble paying it off within 6 months. But he said, so the financial market, the banking, the lending, I should say, in the U.S. is vastly different from Canada in the sense that there's a whole bunch of little banks, and when they get spooked, they really get spooked, and they stay spooked for the rest of the career of that bank officer, right? So because the thing to understand about banks is it's still people that are making the decisions, and they are motivated by getting their bonuses when times are good and not losing their job when times are bad. So if you go into the scenario where times are bad, that not losing your job component takes over. What that is related to primarily is not having bad loans. So they just get really, really careful about making sure that all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted, and there's lots of safety for the bank, so they can't ever be criticized for making a bad loan. And that's the phase we're into already, I think, to a degree. And the bullish, frothy end of the cycle it'll come back eventually, but it's probably years away. It's not months, it's years away. So the banks are tightening, just out of human nature. No more blanket appraisals. It's one of those things where somebody might write a book about the frothiness of the peak of the cycle, and then people will go, "Oh my God, I can't believe they were doing that!" Like, oh, it's just so crazy, right? And yet, when you're in the middle of it, it kind of makes sense, right? But then 3 or 4 years
Mm-hmm.
later, looking back after knowing that housing prices dropped 30, 40, 50%, people will look back and just like that movie about the subprime mortgage thing. I remember the scene with the main character to the girl that was working in the, I think she was
Strip club.
a strip club, and she said, "Yeah, I own 5 houses and a condo or something like that." Like,
I have 5 houses and a condo.
Hey, there's a bubble.
and that was the moment the light bulb went on for him to say, "Oh my God, this is like crazy." Right? And
Mm-hmm.
but at the time, if everybody else is doing it, this is human nature. Like if everybody else is doing it and everybody else thinks it's safe, then it's okay. And unfortunately, people don't realize, I think, that the people running banks are subject to the same influences. So if the Royal Bank sees all the other banks are doing the same thing, or maybe the other way around, if all the other banks see the Royal Bank, because the Royal Bank's kind of a leader, then they think, well, the Royal Bank must know what it's doing, so it must be safe for us to do that too, right? So that's kind of the way it goes. And I because the banks are given this incredible power to create money out of thin air, which is a topic we could discuss if you like.
Yeah.
The power that they have to create new money in the real estate sector is phenomenal. And one of the guys that wrote a blurb on the jacket of my book, Dr. Steve Keen, just came out with a video, a 17-minute video explaining how that works, how the banks create money out of thin air and for mortgage lending. And that, he says that's the key factor in that he uses to track the economy and do scenarios. And he says that's the key difference in allowing these housing bubbles to become so large and eventually causing them to burst is he actually says it's the acceleration in mortgage lending. So it's not the amount of mortgage lending, it's not the increase in mortgage lending, but it's the rate of change in the increase or decrease in the mortgage lending, acceleration or deceleration that he's pinpointed as the with heavy mathematical tools to do it. He's pinpointed as the cause of creating the bubbles and then causing the bursting of the bubble.
And let's go into that a little bit more, because I think people misunderstand this a little bit and they kind of get it wrong when it comes to money creation, because most people, maybe it's because it's heavily politicized now about government deficit spending, and obviously that's a component of it. But where does most of the money creation come from? It's the commercial banks, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And I know I've talked to bankers, I've talked to economists, I've talked to government people. I've talked to many, many people who, when I put that out, they say, "No, that's wrong, Hilliard, you're wrong." And I point them to a paper from the Bank of England in 2012. It's called Modern Money Creation. And it explains how the banks actually create most of the money in the system. So people think of money as cash, but really, I don't know, more than 90% of all the money in the system is deposits in the bank, right? So the way to maybe understand this better is to just think about that moment, because most of us have been there, where you go in, you're going to buy your first house, you have your down payment put together, and you go into the bank and they put a document in front of you and you sign that form, agreeing to take on this huge obligation of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And all of a sudden, like at that moment or a few moments after you sign that form, in your bank account appears several $100,000 or more. And I say, well, where did that money come from? So the traditional economist's view, and it includes central bankers like Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke and many, many other people, say, well, you've got your deposits in the bank, and then you've got your loans in the bank. And the bank is just the intermediary between the deposits and the loans. So they take the money from the deposits and they lend it out to the borrowers. And they take as a middleman, they take a fee in between, and they become very wealthy doing that. And but the problem with that is, then if that were true, and that's the traditional view, when you sign that piece of paper, somebody has a deposit with the bank or a GIC or a term deposit. They've got different terms in the US and Canada and England, but same idea. That has to shrink by that much money. So if you get $500,000 mortgage, somebody's account has to get smaller by $500,000, but it doesn't do that. It's all of the deposits stay the same, and now there's a new $500,000 deposit in your account. So now the amount of deposits in the system just went up by $500,000 just by you signing that agreement. And this is the power of modern money creation, according to the Bank of England and according to Dr. Steve Keen. And it's pretty obvious that that's what actually happens. And the reason you can you can prove it to yourself that actually happens. It's not just having that experience of going to the bank, but if you look at the rate of change in the house prices in Canada, and we have a chart that we put out every month, it shows the rate of change in the house prices, then it shows the rate of inflation, it shows the growth in after-tax income. So the three lines at the bottom are income and inflation, the rate of inflation. And then the red line that sort of steadily goes up is the amount of mortgage debt outstanding. So if you think about that for a minute, you think, okay, so this is an index. It goes from 100, and you can see on the far right there, it's up to 500 roughly, the red line. So there's been a five-fold increase in 25 years of the amount of mortgage debt outstanding. And yet the, let's say the after-tax income is only up to about 200. So mortgage debt has been allowed to increase 2.5 times as fast as the average worker's income. And so that tells you right there that something is happening that is not just a simple matter of deposits and loans and an intermediary in between. Because if mortgage debt were increasing that fast, and that money had to come out of somebody else's deposit, there would be a significant drop in the amount of money in the system to spend on other things beside housing, right? So there would have to be, people would have to save a huge amount of money out of their income, the wealthy people, in order to give that money to the borrower, the young couple that wants to buy a house. And of course, that's not what happens. So the loans create their own deposits. The Bank of England has proven it in their article. There's a guy named Richard Werner, a German economist, who's actually gone even further. And I met him. I spent a week with him a few years ago at Oxford, and he actually got a software. He got into the software of there's a bunch of small banks in Germany. He convinced one of them. He had a terrible time finding a bank to agree to it. But anyway, he convinced one of them to they followed their accounting systems software, and they took out a loan. He took out a loan, and he went through all of the changes and all of the accounting entries in the system, the bank, and nowhere, it was all brand new money. There was nowhere that the money came from. And it's intuitively obvious if you think about it from that point of view. But if you talk to people that are in the system, they'll vehemently deny that that's what's happening, because they just can't cope with that. They've been so used to that standard model of, we're just an intermediary between the depositors and the borrowers, and that's a big hurdle to get over. But eventually, people will understand. So if we accept that that's correct, how money is created in the banking system with new deposits being created every day, then what happens if the rate of mortgage lending shrinks? So the economy goes up roughly by 5% a year. Let's say, inflation is 2 or 3%, real growth is 2 or 3%, so the total is 5 or 6%, because GDP is reported after inflation rates. So the economy needs 5% more money all the time. So what happens? And most of that money comes from bank lending, and most of that money or government. We haven't talked about government spending, but that's another factor. But let's just keep focusing on this for a minute. What happens if people start to stop taking out new mortgages for whatever reason? Like the guy in the example we used a minute ago of the 1.2 million condo is worth 800,000 on completion. He's not going to get a mortgage, right? So that new mortgage lending is not happening in that case, and that deposit will never be created. And so that means that the amount of money in the system is going to shrink, or at least not grow as fast as it was growing before. The deceleration would be the Steve Keen's term, and that is a huge lag on the market, and that not only causes house prices to come down. So the peak was in 2022 of house prices. They're down from 10 to 20%, something like that. And you can see there's the Steve Keen chart. You can see that the top line, the blue line, is the house price index, and you can see the red line is household debt. So the amount of debt is basically flatlined, and house prices, not a surprise, house prices have come down. They have to come down. There isn't now. With the exception, there's a caveat on this. There could be money coming in from foreign sources, like money laundering, or investors from outside of Canada come in with new money that could keep the housing bubble going faster. But since most of the money in the system comes from people in Canada just buying their first house or upgrading from the first house to the second house, that outside money would have to be enormous. And of course, the thing about that outside money is it goes away quickly once they see house prices starting to level off. There's always another country to go to, and Canada is no longer the country to go to. So and it also depends on what the laws are and money laundering, that sort of thing. And those are being tightened up, not as quickly as I would have liked to have seen. I think it's ridiculous that it's taken like very, very long to to tighten that up, but eventually it is getting tighter. And Canada's looser than the U.S. The U.S. is tighter, and TD Bank, the fiasco with TD Bank will tell you that the Americans caught TD Bank with money laundering in the U.S. They got into big trouble. It's a huge issue for the TD Bank, and nobody in Canada ever said a word about it. Now, there's two possibilities. They were only doing it in the U.S. but not in Canada, or the Canadian authorities just never looked that closely, right? So I think the money that was coming into Vancouver, one report, the Peter German report, said as much as $15 billion in 1 year at the peak of it. There has to be some deposits that were coming in from foreign sources that were not examined very carefully. And with that, so if that dries up, then and also the new mortgage lending dries up. And if we could just go back to that chart again, there was a couple of things I wanted to point out on that Steve Keen chart. Look at the middle there. You've got a long period there between 1990 and 2000 where the blue line actually goes backwards. So that's the last time we really had any significant drop in the housing prices. And it was more of a sideways move than a big drop. But you can see the mortgage growth was also pretty muted. And then around 2002 or 2003, mortgage growth just took off and accelerated for the next basically 20 years to 2022. You can see if you go look a little bit further up where that vertical line is, that's the dotted line is the GFC, the global financial crisis. You can see that house prices started to come down right after that dotted line there. What happened to mortgage debt? It's totally accelerated to like it was growing by a huge amount every month. And that got us out of the GFC. Well, unlike the US, where there's thousands of banks involved, and many of them disappeared because they were too heavily invested in mortgages, and the government didn't bail them out. They bailed out the big ones in Wall Street, but they didn't bail out all the little ones. And so in the US, you had that went on for basically 6 years. In Canada, it went on for maybe 1 or 2 years. It didn't really get bad at all. The blue line you can see dipped there slightly, and then very quickly it was back into the growth again.
Hit the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started. Thanks to Kinster for sponsoring today's video.